Imagine a time when the bread on your table was baked fresh, from grains harvested just a few miles from your home. The milk you drank came from a cow you knew by name, and your meals were cooked with ingredients that your ancestors would recognize. Now, fast forward to today, where most of the foods we consume are made in factories, often miles away from where they're eaten, loaded with preservatives, and bear little resemblance to the crops and animals they once were. What happened? How did America go from a land of local, organic farming to one dominated by processed, pre-packaged, ultra-convenient foods? The answer lies in the complex history of processed foods, a tale shaped by innovation, government regulation, corporate influence, and the ever-changing tastes and demands of American consumers. This is the story of how our food system transformed, and what it means for us today. At the birth of the United States, the country's economy was heavily reliant on agriculture. For most American families, food came from their own land or nearby farms. Local organic farming practices were the norm because there wasn't an alternative. Crops were grown according to the season, and livestock was raised on pastures without the use of synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, or growth hormones. What you ate was largely determined by what could be grown or raised in your region, and food production was deeply intertwined with the natural cycles of the land. Before the mid-1800s, the idea of processed food was limited to rudimentary methods like salting, drying, smoking, and fermenting, which were used to preserve food for the off-season. These methods were essential for survival, especially during harsh winters or times of drought. Food production was labor-intensive, and as a result, food was precious, carefully rationed, and often shared within local communities. However, the American diet was about to undergo dramatic changes, spurred by the Industrial Revolution. As cities grew and more people moved away from rural areas, the demand for food that could travel long distances and last longer began to rise. This created the perfect storm for the birth of the processed food industry. The late 19th and early 20th centuries marked a pivotal shift in how Americans produced and consumed food. With the rise of factories and mass production techniques, food companies began to experiment with ways to make food last longer and be more convenient to produce and transport. This was the dawn of the industrialized food system. Canning, one of the earliest forms of food processing, became a widespread practice during this period. First invented by Frenchman Nicolas Appert in the early 1800s, canning was quickly adopted by American food companies to preserve fruits, vegetables, and meats for longer periods. It played a critical role during the Civil War, as soldiers required non-perishable foods that could sustain them on the battlefield. Soon after, canning became a household staple, allowing families to stockpile food that would have otherwise spoiled. As factories grew, so did advances in food preservation techniques. Refrigeration and pasteurization were two major breakthroughs that changed the American food landscape forever. In 1864, Louis Pasteur developed the pasteurization process, which reduced harmful bacteria in milk, extending its shelf life and making it safer to drink. Refrigeration allowed food to be transported across the country without spoiling, which further disconnected people from the sources of their food. For the first time, Americans were eating foods that came from hundreds or even thousands of miles away. By the early 1900s, processed foods were making their way into American homes at an unprecedented rate. Breakfast cereals like cornflakes and canned soups, like Campbell's Soup, became kitchen staples, and food companies were investing heavily in marketing campaigns that promised convenience and nutrition at a low cost. The era of convenience foods had begun, and there was no turning back. World War I and World War II accelerated the rise of processed foods in America. During the wars, the government needed to feed millions of soldiers overseas while ensuring that civilians at home had enough to eat. This led to a boom in food production, with companies developing new ways to process and package foods that could be easily transported, stored, and consumed. In World War I, the U.S. government partnered with food manufacturers to develop products like powdered milk, canned meats, and dehydrated vegetables that could be shipped to soldiers on the front lines. These innovations not only kept soldiers fed, but also set the stage for post-war food trends. World War II further fueled the demand for processed foods as rationing became a way of life in the United States. To meet the needs of both soldiers and civilians, food companies were encouraged to produce shelf-stable, pre-packaged foods. As America entered the 1950s and 60s, the food industry underwent another transformation, this time driven by corporate power. Major food companies like General Mills, Kraft, and Kellogg's began to dominate the market, and the rise of supermarket chains further consolidated their influence. These corporations were able to mass-produce processed foods on an unprecedented scale, and their marketing departments were hard at work, convincing consumers that these products were healthier, tastier, and more convenient than homemade meals. The creation of brand loyalty became a major strategy, with companies investing heavily in advertising campaigns aimed at housewives and families. The convenience of boxed cake mixes, frozen dinners, and processed snacks became a selling point, and brands promised to make life easier while keeping families fed. Television played a key role in shaping food trends during this era. Ads for breakfast cereals, soft drinks, and snack foods flooded the airwaves, promoting the idea that processed foods were the future. Meanwhile, government policies, particularly farm subsidies, encouraged the production of corn, soy, and wheat, ingredients that would become the building blocks of many processed foods. Corn syrup, for example, would later become a key ingredient in countless products, from soft drinks to baked goods, transforming the American diet. This was also the era when fast food chains like McDonald's and Burger King began to emerge, offering processed, pre-made meals that were cheap, quick, and consistent. Fast food, like processed food, became a symbol of modern American life, reflecting the nation's growing emphasis on convenience and efficiency over quality and nutrition. Government regulations have played a significant role in shaping the processed food industry. From food safety laws to nutritional guidelines, federal agencies like the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, have been instrumental in defining what goes into our food and how it's labeled. In the early 20th century, scandals about food safety prompted the government to step in. Upton Sinclair's 1906 novel, The Jungle, exposed the unsanitary conditions of the meatpacking industry, leading to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. These laws were designed to protect consumers by regulating the safety and labeling of food products. Over the decades, regulations evolved to include nutritional labeling and restrictions on certain additives and preservatives. The Nutrition Labeling and Education Act of 1990, for instance, required food companies to provide detailed information about the nutritional content of their products, empowering consumers to make more informed choices. However, government policies have also contributed to the rise of processed foods. Farm subsidies, introduced during the Great Depression and expanded in the post-war era, have encouraged the overproduction of certain crops like corn and soy. These crops are often used to create cheap ingredients like high-fructose corn syrup and hydrogenated oils, which are found in countless processed foods. In the 1970s, under the Nixon administration, Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz famously encouraged farmers to get big or get out, promoting industrial agriculture and the mass production of cheap commodities. This shift toward large-scale farming further disconnected consumers from the source of their food, as processed products became more affordable and accessible than fresh, local produce. As processed foods became more available, consumer habits began to shift. The rise of the two-income household meant that families had less time to prepare meals from scratch, and the convenience of processed foods became increasingly attractive. Fast food restaurants flourished, and the microwave oven revolutionized home cooking, making it easier than ever to prepare prepackaged meals in minutes. In the 1980s and 90s, diet culture and the low-fat craze further shaped food trends. Consumers were drawn to products labeled as low-fat or fat-free, which often contained more sugar and artificial ingredients to compensate for the lack of fat. This led to the proliferation of diet sodas, low-fat snacks, and processed foods marketed as healthy alternatives to traditional meals. However, as the processed food industry grew, so did concerns about the health impacts of these products. By the early 2000s, research began to highlight the links between processed foods and rising rates of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease in America.